Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Andrew Forrest. In 1973, Norman Mailer coined the term factoid in his biography about Marilyn Monroe. A factoid is something that looks like a fact, could be a fact, but in fact is not a fact. It's an unreliable piece of information that has been repeated so often that it has that ring of truth. For example, some people believe the Great Wall of China can be seen from the moon, but that's a factoid. For that to be true, your eyesight would need to be roughly 17,000 times better than 20/20. Today, I want to talk about another factoid that you may have heard about, net zero. It's a cute phrase that trips off the tongue. It's touted as the world's solution to climate change. But it's a lie. Net zero isn't a real solution. Net zero is a carte blanche to continue using fossil fuels but offset the emissions by pretending we can capture all of the carbon dioxide we emit and burying it underground or planting enough trees to cover the whole of the Great Simpson Desert in the middle of dry and arid Australia. Not going to happen. It's thanks to net zero that we're now inundated with charming oxymorons such as clean coal and blue hydrogen. I ask you to throw out the term net zero and commit to absolute zero. Absolute zero requires three things. Firstly, it requires 100% green, renewable, zero emissions energy. There's no carbon in that supply chain. There's no carbon in wind, no carbon in solar, tidal, hydro, and geothermal. Secondly, it requires a new zero emissions energy carrier, one that can replace the fuels used by the world's dirtiest sectors, the ones that we can't currently electrify. That energy carrier is green hydrogen and green ammonia. And lastly, it requires that all of us, that we stand up, that we resist together against the factoids, the shoddy science masquerading as fact that says we can keep using fossil fuels, everything will be just fine. With just a month to go before COP26, the most important meeting of the decade, perhaps in our lifetimes, it is time to end the era of greenwashing and, eyes wide open, establish a new era of real climate protection, one that is founded on transparency, founded on science, and founded on reality. So today, I want to talk to you about the forgotten sectors. These are the sectors like mine, the dirtiest, ugliest, least glamorous reaches of industry. Iron, steel, fertilizers, cement, aluminium, heating, air travel, and shipping. You recognize all of them. They are completely essential to the continuation of society, yet an enormous and growing source of emissions and currently undecarbonizable. I should know. My iron ore company in Australia, Forrest, is the fourth largest iron ore company in the world. Every year, our operations produce 2 million tonnes of carbon, and if you add the shipping to our customers, it more than doubles. This is more than the emissions of Iceland, yet a fraction of what my colleagues in the iron ore industry produce. Together, iron ore and all the hard to decarbonise sectors add up to almost 25% of all global emissions. But with you, I plan to change that. We are creating a global green hydrogen industry and have established a multi-billion-dollar initiative to drive it called FFI. 11 years ago, we started working on green hydrogen. 5 years ago, we started acquiring early technology to transport and store it. And when COVID hit, we used the opportunity to travel the world to test the hypothesis that green energy is so abundant that it can power all the world for all time. Green hydrogen, to be clear, is hydrogen made from water using only renewable electricity. It is the Swiss Army knife of energy because it is versatile. It can reach the most challenging industry sectors, from heavy manufacturing to long-distance trucking, cargo ships and aircraft. And green hydrogen is not a speculative technology. It is already being produced at pilot scale in many parts of the world where renewable energy is cheap and abundant. Some people are calling it the new oil, and one that doesn't end our environment. Hyundai, like us, are a huge and heavy emitting company, but they totally reflect our own belief of their responsibility and our conviction together that green hydrogen can be for everybody, everything, and everywhere. So, if that's the truth, if it can be, then it must be. And I was delighted to see that they offer fuel cells in all commercial vehicles by 2028. Because we need action now. 2050 just kicks the can down the road. But what's really exciting about green hydrogen is that it promises to redraw the map of global energy, trade, and wealth. Why? Because you can make it anywhere in the world. Some of the poorest countries today are sitting on the biggest potential sources of green hydrogen. Green hydrogen sunshine will throw a lifeline to the Middle East, allow them to diversify their economies away from oil and gas. And if the Middle East can do it, so can everybody. These are not visions. They are getting built. And once FFI has approvals, it will start the development of what could one day become a portfolio of 150 different and major green energy and green hydrogen projects all around the world. And at Fortescue, as I have introduced, we are a heavy carbon emitter. So we've set ourselves a world-leading target of heavy industry, of heavy emitters, of zero emissions by 2030. So that might be okay for Fortescue. It can actually lower its operating costs substantially by going green. But so can every heavy emitter, every heavy industry, every heavy manufacturing company. And to allow them to do that, we're not just looking after ourselves at 2030. Our aim is to produce 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen every year by 2030, increasing to 50 million tonnes per year thereafter. A scale of zero emissions, zero pollution energy production equal to the very largest oil and gas companies that exist today. We're securing resources all over the world and at home. In Tasmania, we're planning to build a 250 megawatt green hydrogen facility at Bell Bay, which, when built in early 23, will be the largest in the world. And these big hydrogen projects are great news for local economies and therefore should be welcomed everywhere. Not only are they clean and totally green, our Tasmanian project at Bell Bay will add around 18 billion Australian dollars to Tasmania's economy and thousands of new employment opportunities which otherwise would not have existed. Green hydrogen has the power to help everyone, everywhere. We also have a team of scientists who have successfully figured out how to use renewable energy to convert iron ore to green iron at low temperatures without the use of coal, a stepping stone to creating an entirely new green steel industry in Australia or anywhere in the world. Last week, I visited another of our teams, a team of women and men who were given a target of only 130 days to build the world's first hydrogen fuel cell haul truck, and drill rig, and a green ammonia powered train, and a ship engine. 130 days to start the next industrial revolution. And they did it. When those huge engines started, I was shocked. Instead of what we all expected, I was greeted with silence, the sound of the future. And instead of the expected smell of exhaust and sight of smoke, there was only a little steam, pure, beautiful water, the vision of the future. Why was I only the third person in the world, the other two were the engineers who built it, driven a hydrogen fuel cell haul truck? And why did this 130-day breakthrough not happen decades earlier? The answer is that there were no societal settings, no government encouragement, complete silence on carbon emissions, and the looming disasters ahead of us. Green hydrogen is the solution we need to get to absolute zero. But right now, of the 60 million tonnes of hydrogen produced every year, 96% is still made from fossil fuels. If you just let these emissions drift into the air, it's called grey hydrogen. If you try to capture the CO2 and store it underground, industry calls it blue, or that famous oxymoron, clean hydrogen. But blue hydrogen is not clean. And tragically, most governments, without a scintilla of science, are throwing tens of billions of dollars in subsidies at it. The truth is that the fossil fuel industry has lobbied hard, and you'll see a spectacular example of this at COP26, to get taxpayers to fund their attempt at transition to their version of clean energy. But that's a highway to climate disaster. Let me explain why blue hydrogen will never be low carbon. For one thing, its entire process is full of carbon. Unlike green, zero carbon. And the other reason is methane. Natural gas is made up of methane, a greenhouse gas that is 86 times worse than carbon across its 20-year lifespan. The blue hydrogen supply chain leaks methane every step of the way. These emissions are conveniently called fugitive emissions because they cannot be prevented. They're also largely unmeasured, but there's strong evidence that the world is severely underestimating them. For example, a highly credible study in 2018, published by 160 scientists in the journal Science, found that the US oil and gas industry was emitting 60% more methane than their own government had estimated. Then there's the flaring of natural gas, which is also integral to blue hydrogen supply chains. Every year, the world flares an amount of gas which is largely composed of methane, 86 times more dangerous than carbon, equivalent to an entire natural gas demand of Africa in any 1 year. We estimate that is almost 150 times Fortescue's annual CO2 emissions, and emitted by the fossil fuel industry and not measured as a waste product. Via flaring alone, not even fugitive emissions. And this is before the fossil fuel can even be put economically to productive use, let alone making hydrogen from it. It gets worse. Supporters of blue hydrogen say, hey, don't worry about our CO2 emissions. We'll use carbon capture and storage, CCS, to bury them underground. But get this, currently there are only roughly 20 pilot CCS plants in existence, and they capture just 0.4% of the carbon dioxide emitted globally by power stations and industrial processes. 0.4%. What you don't hear from industry is that carbon capture and storage, despite having received billions of subsidies for decades, remains an unproven absolute failure and far from commercial viability, yet still it's trotted out by the fossil fuel sector to audiences who don't have time and politicians who are looking the other way. Some forward-looking countries have seen through the greenwash and are firmly committed to green hydrogen. Chile, France, New Zealand, Portugal and Spain. But most countries, including my own, are dithering, unsure whether to back green hydrogen or blindly commit to yet more fossil fuels. This time disguised as blue hydrogen, which at least until the electorate wakes up, can be passed off as climate change action by some politicians who either haven't done their homework or are confident that the science won't reach their voters before the ballot box does. How do we get out of this mess and ensure we reach absolute zero in time to avoid dangerous climate change? There are 4 steps out of the current mess. Firstly, we need legislation in every country that sets a target of absolute zero by 2050 latest. At the last count, over 60% of countries have committed to net zero by 2050. It's time for the heel draggers and the hesitant to come out of the shadows. We also need legislation that encourages the establishment of a global green hydrogen market, de-risks investments and supports R&D. Governments can put in place legislation empowered by the foresight of their citizens, or they can be forced increasingly through climate litigation. Second, we need a global hydrogen accreditation system, one that is far less forgiving than the current industry standard, which classifies hydrogen as low carbon, even if it emits 4 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of hydrogen. It's a laughable low bar and doesn't even factor in fugitive methane emissions I've just discussed, just misses them. Our accreditation system, which we hope Australia will be launching soon, will be properly stringent. If your hydrogen carbon intensity is above a certain threshold, say 1 to 1, then the country or company buying it will know. And all hydrogen will come with a certificate of origin. So you will know if it's been produced using green, zero carbon in the supply chain, renewable energy, or fossil fuel. Thirdly, we need legislation that requires full disclosure by industry of its methane emissions. Cutting methane emissions is the best opportunity we have to slow the rate of global warming. But companies aren't required to even measure their methane emissions, 87 times more powerful and deadly than carbon, let alone report or reduce them. Lastly, we must ban all forms of carbon offsets, including carbon capture and storage, or at least disallow them from becoming industry's golden ticket to net zero. Of the 2,000 largest publicly traded companies by sales, 92% of those that have committed to net zero are relying on offsets to get there, paying for emission reductions elsewhere rather than cutting their own. I know this to be true because my own companies do it. But we certainly do not consider offsets our golden ticket to absolute zero in the long term. No, we will achieve that through green hydrogen and renewable energy alone. And we're throwing our entire company at its availability to you, to Hyundai, and as they say, to everyone, everything, and everywhere. Eleanor Roosevelt once wrote, "We cannot any longer take an old approach to world problems. They aren't the same problems. It isn't the same world." She was a fiercely intelligent and truly visionary pioneer and probably would have been disappointed at the lack of women on this panel. Her words from 1961 are just as relevant today. So if you take home only 2 messages from me, it is this: if it's not green, it's not clean. Everything else is a smokescreen, a factoid, an expensive distraction. Don't fall for it. Secondly, if we come together on this at COP26, we have a real chance to fix the problem of climate change for good. Let's come together. Thank you.